Frank asked me to talk about sort of military readiness, sequestration, 2014, and it's a great time, right, with the doomsday clock ticking, as it were, for Monday. You know, we don't have to wait for sequestration to bite us, for the military to have readiness problems. Today's military is not ready. Now, this may seem implausible to you, given we're talking about a decade of war, huge increases in defense budgets over a lot of that period, growth in the size of the Army and Marine Corps, even that's coming down, but it's true. Let me give you some examples of that. The forces haven't practiced a number of key missions for the future, in some cases for years. The Marine Corps will tell you they just never did amphibious warfare for most of that period. Have to go back and practice amphibious warfare. We're not talking about in chomp. We're talking about at a lower level, but still haven't done that. The Army hasn't done real combined arms maneuver warfare exercises at a level that really kind of gets everybody up to speed on that, because they've been concentrated on getting everybody ready to go to Iraq and Afghanistan. ASW is another one. The Navy will tell you. They got to get back in the ASW game. So those are just three examples of readiness issues. Lack of sufficient training, and by the way, that takes years to remedy and lots of money, whether it's people, O&M funds to go out there and do things. Can't do it from shore in a lot of cases, or in all cases. We've allowed much of our fleets of vehicles, ships, and aircraft to grow older, even obsolescent, as time has gone on. So in a sense, that brings up, if you're going to think about O&M, cost of O&M keeps going up just to keep a fleet, and oftentimes a smaller fleet of ships, planes, and vehicles going. We failed to invest sufficiently in a host of next-generation capabilities. I would put out EW just as one. Hardening for things against EMP is another example. There's a whole host of these. So if you want to talk about readiness for the future, there are already holes in the process. Our two conflicts over the last decade and the patterns of investment we went through to support them also created new pockets of what I'll call unreadiness. This is due to the way we responded to urgent operational needs from the theater. Lots of capabilities flowed in. I mean, you're probably all familiar with MRAPs, and the way early MRAPs, man, the military went out and grabbed anybody who knew anything about up-armoring trucks, including the South Africans. The list, BAE got involved in that off of old patents that actually went back to old South African days, on and on and on. But we did most of that as one-offs. So the Rapid Fielding Initiative, Rapid Equipping Force, and the like, with very little test and evaluation. Did it in the field in a lot of cases, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. No thought about integration with existing systems and stuff we were planning to bring on. Army's now doing that in the network integration evaluations, but it's catch-up time. And no sustainment planning. Another example is aerial tactical ISR. We did great stuff. Task Force Odin, some of the stuff in Afghanistan, bringing in the Vigilant Stare aircraft, Gorgon Stare sensors. But there were like a dozen different variants of aircraft out there, and they're now trying to essentially make sure that things can talk to each other, that we actually have management plans for the sensors. The Army wants to go back to something called EMARS, and sort of consolidate everything in a single class of vehicles with a common set of sensors so they can manage things in a cost-effective fashion. So you have essentially lack of readiness or incipient lack of readiness off of some of the good things we actually did during the last decade of wars. So we're starting from a disadvantageous position, even before we hit sequestration and a potential CR. Now, on top of that, a number of you know, maybe all of you, the way a CR works along with sequestration is particularly bad for our readiness. It's not just the cuts. The cuts alone are a problem, and in particular because as you're taking them with no backloading, it's all determined. Every year you get that 10% cut on due to sequestration, and then the CR keeps you limited to the last budget, but you can't sort of vary things the way you want. But also, it's particularly bad on the accounts that have the money. So if I exclude personnel, and there's how much is there in the facilities, the construction accounts, right? I go two places. For immediate money, which would be FY14, I go to O&M, and then as I'm going forward, I go to the procurement accounts, and that's what you're seeing particularly happen. Now, on top of that, because of the way the game is being played by the Pentagon, they are going to pretend like they did last year. We saw this last year. There's no reason to believe we're not going to see it again, that if a CR continues, through before we get a budget, what's going to happen is that the cuts will end up being back-loaded. So we'll spend a quarter to half a year operating as if there was going to be maybe a CR, but no sequestration, and then it hits, which means what will be a 10% cut, if I ran it through across the year, can become a 20, 30, even 50% cut. We may find that in August of September of fiscal 2014, half, two-thirds of certain kinds of capabilities, fleets, are simply going to be grounded because there ain't no money. The MPS fleet, found out this yesterday in a discussion with, frankly, with the vendor. They end up, because of what MARAD was doing, the Marine Administration, which sort of manages the sort of support ship program, the last 2 months of the year, there was no money to support the sort of commercial military transportation of cargoes. And these are the guys going out to deliver stuff to Karachi to go up to the troops in Afghanistan. The companies involved took it out of hide. Why was that? It was because they spent the money on a 12-month cycle, no prorating because sequestration was going to come, and then they took the hit in the last 2 months. They literally told the companies, take it out of hide, which frankly, amazingly, these companies, including Maersk Lines, which is actually a foreign company, did apparently willingly. Okay? So you've got that problem, which is sort of not just a 10% cut, depending on the account, it can get up to just eye-watering practical levels. The impact of sequestration on the industrial base, which isn't often mentioned. We're talking about readiness, but let's be expansive, if you will, only a little bit about readiness and about its definition. Army is looking to shutter the nation's sole tank and armored infantry fighting vehicle plants. Now, they claim they're only going to do it for a couple of years. Anybody who's ever had anything to do with industry, in fact, if you've just tried to hold on to a good plumber or car mechanic, right, and you sort of find they can't keep the business going, or you haven't gone to a while, you go back, they're not there anymore. Try finding another one. It's the same whether you're talking welders, people with experience in making and upgrading these systems. Try coming back 2 or 3 years later and find them. Northrop Grumman, actually now I guess it was Huntington Ingalls, will now tell you, they still haven't recovered at Pascagoula for 2005 because people sort of went off after the hurricane, found other things to do that they were interested in, wasn't as dangerous, wasn't as hazardous, and never came back. Sequestration will do the same thing to us on an industrial level if we're not extremely careful. We've taken delivery really of the last C-17 if you're in Boeing, okay? And if there's not going to be additional foreign sales, we will go out of the large military aircraft business until, if ever, we go into the new bomber business. We will have the C-130 program. That will be it as a dedicated platform. Commercial, Boeing's going to do the commercial stuff for the KC-46 and the P-8, but a dedicated thing, wide body, nah, out of the business. So how bad could this be for the military? Well, last year's sequestration, for while it lasted, grounded more U.S. combat aircraft, Air Force and Navy, than were lost at Pearl Harbor. I ran the numbers, right? Now, obviously, grounded for temporarily is not shot down or bombed on the ground, but I want to make the case. I mean, this was worse than Pearl Harbor of last year, right? Air Force had 33 squadrons, 12 combat coded, that had to stand out, parked, essentially, all right? Maintenance for the Navy, maintenance availabilities, over 24 were at least held back. In fact, one of them was the Lincoln, the refueling of the Lincoln. And if you know anything about carriers, there's one place to do refueling, there's one place to do demil, and there's sort of a timeline, calendar, including, I guess, the Enterprise decommissioning, which goes out for decades. So if you start delaying this thing, guess what? Carriers don't go to sea 2 or 3 years from now, speaking about lack of readiness. Last time, the military was able to recover by using kind of budgetary devices, such as exploiting unexpended balances. But this is a one-trick pony. Won't have that for 14, and going forward, even worse. So I would argue to you, real quickly and simply, the future of military readiness is pretty bleak. The Army, I have Army sources that rate its readiness for combat brigades as the lowest in 40 years. You know, these are the old C1, C2, C3 kind of status. Lower than during the height of the Cold War, lower than in the aftermath of Vietnam, or at the aftermath of Vietnam. It's about as bad as it's ever been in modern memory, if you will. Going forward, The Navy projects that if you have a full year of sequestration, it's going to lose half of its ship maintenance availabilities and reduce its training for a lot more of the ships to what they call just in time, so that they can get away from the pier, fingers crossed, if they absolutely have to. It will shut down 2 air wings for 3 months, and this is an estimate. They may vary it when it actually comes up, but it gives you a sense of the scale of this thing, and limit 4 others to only minimum levels of flying. 6 carrier air wings. 60%, actually, even more when you sort of talk about who's really able to go out into the field. Testimony last week, I only found it in one place, which is Breaking Defense. The Joint Chiefs before the HASC were unanimous in their conclusion that were sequestration to continue, they would be unable to meet their basic command responsibilities. According to Breaking Defense, this is a quote, each of the Joint Chiefs was asked by Representative Randy Forbes if they could execute the military's basic strategic planning guidance missions, which is, handle one war, defeat, and deter another, sort of the 1.5 kind of, which is down from the 2, which we used to have consistently for 20 years as our goal. Two fights, not quite simultaneous, but overlapping. Down the line, he went. Army, no. Navy, no. Air Force, no. And bless their hearts, General Amos in the Marine Corps, yes, but. Now, I expect sequestration to last at least through 2014, and frankly, we can have an argument about this, but I think it's likely to extend easily through 2016 until the next presidential elections. Moreover, got to tell you, I travel around the Washington circles, talk to my peers and others and the financial analysts and Hill people, you name it. Growing sense from knowledgeable observers that the sequestration budget levels could, in fact, establish a ceiling, not a floor, for the budget. Now, if you think overall federal spending is projected to rise sharply in the next couple of years, and that's even if you sort of want to believe the administration on things like the cost of Obamacare and all the rest, which will reignite, if you can, I guess pour gasoline on the fire would be a better metaphor for this, the issues of taxes and spending beyond what the height of the burning even now. So faced with these problems, right, rapid increase in the cost of government deficits as a result, and no serious, and by serious I mean, the kind of classic existential, they're coming across the Canadian or Mexican borders or, into Chesapeake Bay, kind of threat to national security, defense spending could continue its slide downward beyond even what sequestration has projected. And I got to tell you, you get to sort of levels of 2.5% of GDP for defense, you're out of business as a world power. You simply are. All right, I'll stop there and happy to take any questions or disagreements or comments.
Dan, thank you. Obviously, extraordinarily grim portents, but most especially if you prove right, and I fear you will, that we're looking at, further downward trajectories here, not corrective action. Could I ask you just to develop a point that you touched on, and I'm really glad you did, because I think it's something that most of us don't pay enough attention to. We may be aware of the problems with respect to units and readiness and capabilities and so on, but the thing that may ultimately determine the future capabilities of the country could well be that industrial base. And you're absolutely right. I'm just staggered by the idea that we're going to allow the C-17 to go out of business when I think clearly there's a continuing need for at least the capability. But if you would, Dan, talk just for a minute about, and maybe our colleague from Boeing might like to say a word about this too, but the impact not just at the prime level, but in the second and third tiers of critical component manufacturing. Where are we in terms of the robustness of the industrial base more generally?
I'll tell you, honestly, we don't know, and in due deference to the primes or even the bigger subcontractors, they can't always tell, a level or two below. And to the extent we are going to become, we already, but more reliant on commercial items. You go look at Pratt Whitney on using commercial derivatives of engines that are on the military side. They don't collect the kind of data once they go, they don't collect pricing data, which infuriates the Pentagon, but they don't, kind of watch them that way. And so it's really hard to know until a problem arises in many cases. In some cases, the companies do a really good job, but there's a lot of these subs and all the rest to keep track of, and it's fairly easy. More to the point, you've got a DOD that is increasingly doing 3 or 4 things aside from sequestration that simply makes the situation not just worse, but intolerable. One is going for what's being called lowest price technically acceptable for contracting, which simply means as long as you pass the minimum threshold, past performance may not count, technical competence may barely count because you just got to hit the bar. Anything you add to the game aren't going to play. This has affected things like the new helicopter. One bid for the presidential helicopter, one bid essentially will come out for the new search and rescue helicopter. Why? Because it looked to the companies as a price shootout, and the companies that offered better quality, but at a higher price, said, it's a losing game. I'm just going to spend millions of dollars and not get it. So you have this question of the department pushing things down in the name of price over everything. Secondly, if you're doing commercial, there's not only a demand for data, even though you're buying commercial, the contract monitors want to have certified cost and price data, which the companies on the commercial side cannot give you, or give the government, because they don't collect it that way. And of course, if you provide something, it turns out, you claim it's certified, it turns out to be an error, people go to jail. So you don't want to do that. Thirdly, there's an assumption built into a lot of this, and it's evident on some of the stuff with armored vehicles, but you can see it, that I've got 7 makers of pick your kind of item, even in the U.S., welding shops, metal bending shop, whatever, and that if I lose the one that does military stuff, the other 6 will be willing to be in the military business. Now, just kind of a thought experiment. If the situation defense spending is as I'm describing it to you, simply on the gross scale, anybody want to bet how many of those 6 commercial companies is really going to say, oh, please, I really want to jump into this briar patch and now sell to the federal government or become a government contractor and put in the security and all the rest? The answer is you don't know whether anybody will show up at the door. I mean, we spent literally billions of dollars bringing what were sort of one-off or foreign companies who were selling overseas from the U.S. up to snuff to do things for the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan. Same thing. So the answer is, we're going to lose them, clearly. A lot of these are mom-and-pop stores. A lot of these are minority and veteran-owned, operated businesses. The department isn't even willing to tell us how these sub-tiers who do specialized small mom-and-pop kind of things, how badly they're going to be hit. But my estimation is it's going to be catastrophic for a lot of them.
Did you want to say something?
Sure, just add to the discussion as well on the C-17 case specifically. That I think when you talk industrial base, the second and third order magnitudes are as you've described them. A couple of other things I'd mention is, I think one of the things, a mature program like C-17 was able to provide back to our company really was the revenue stream which allowed future research and development.
Good point.
So I think that across any company, whether it's Boeing or Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, et cetera, they'd find the same thing. Once you lose that stream, your ability really to invest the way we should be now in terms of research and development is really crimped. The other thing is you mentioned in terms of industrial base, I'd say on C-17 is there are very specific technologies that were developed around that aircraft that you lose forever. I mean, whether it's short takeoff and landing, for example.
Yeah,
The engineering that goes into the types of landing gear that you have to have on the aircraft. That is secret sauce that only we control, the U.S. government controls, that couldn't be replaced. And I think one of the other things, the last point I'd make is when you take something like C-17, for example, it's really the last aerospace manufacturing facility of that magnitude within the state of California. And so all of a sudden, you've got one of the largest states in the country where you have elected representatives, be they at the federal or the state level, that no longer understand what that means, no longer touch that.
Great point.
And so when you lose something like that again and you try to reconstitute it, as we surely will someday, it becomes very, very challenging and really be stressful, I think, for the
Good points.
government.
Did
Thank
you want to say anything
No,
on that?
it's
Okay.
good.
George? What, Mike?
It was about a year ago over at AEI, they had a session with Congressman Adam Smith, who I think is one of the brightest individuals on the Hill. And he paused and he said, you know, if you'd asked me 6 months ago about sequestering, I was adamantly against it. He said, but what's happening right now, the drinking of the bathwater, he says, we need a wake-up call here in the military and in Washington and Congress, like a Pearl Harbor or a 9/11. But the other point he made is you talk about the sky is falling, what's going to happen to the military? I go back to my district, and he said, I've got Fort Lewis in my district. I've got McChord Air Force Base. I've got major facilities. My constituents aren't in the least worried or concerned about what's going to happen to the military. What they're worried about, what's going to happen to their medical costs, what's going to happen to their 401ks. And so you look at what came out of the Pew poll, I guess, a few months ago. How many of the people in the country are really worried about what's going to happen to the military? They just don't see it. So I think that we're sort of living, like he said, sort of in a bubble here inside the Beltway. And your comments.
Yeah. Look, I mean, imagine a decade ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, if you had had the Joint Chiefs, and before them, of course, you had Secretaries of Defense, you had, the chairman get up before Congress. We've done this about half a dozen times last year and say this will be catastrophic, we can't do our job. And before the relevant committees, we're not talking about sort of just standing outside the building here as in pontificating. All four major Joint Chiefs saying to the HASC, we will not be able to do our job. Was it on the front page of the Post of the Times? No. In fact, I went around looking. It wasn't even the Wall Street Journal didn't carry it on the front page. All right? I mean, it's a declaration. We call it a declaration of surrender. I don't know what you kind of would phrase it as, but something of that magnitude, and it isn't even noteworthy. So my view is really, to take your point, this 70-some-year-old national consensus on security is busted. Now, the problem with that, there may not be a problem with that if you sort of say, okay, so we're going to come home and all the rest. That is not what the administration is doing. We have a military that is operating consistently for 20 years at 4 times the deployment rate as during the Cold War. It's half the size, now going lower. It's budgetarily even smaller, and it's doing 4 times the work. So if you do the half the size times the 4, it's got a kind of a use rate 8 times what it was on less money, less net money, and it's got rising fixed costs. Inside the military, if you look at the rising cost of health care, veterans benefits, et cetera, I'm not complaining about that. My view is they deserve it, but pay the bill. But you're going to have this budget coming down, the fixed costs coming up. I put it another way, which is the way sequestration works is it pits the active against the retired, the military against civilians, and essentially, Medicare against national security or domestic security against national security. I mean, it is much worse. But absent a consensus, why shouldn't this thing continually edge lower? And if the administration were to say, got it, we're leaving the world, we're doing a Brit, we're going east of Suez, bye, let whatever happen, that'd be a good thing. They're not. Syria's the example. If anything, I'm hearing that they want more out of the military. They want it faster, smarter, more agile, and we're spending less. You couldn't create a scenario more exquisitely designed for catastrophe than the one we're going into.